One of the most popular questions we had is, do we each have a specific purpose, or is it self-chosen, Greg?
Well, in my view, if God has made us for a reason and he wants us to be in relationship with us, each individual person has different capabilities. And fulfilling those capabilities that God has given him, general ones and specific ones, like I have my own peculiar capabilities, doing that is going to make me satisfied, okay?
So did God give me a purpose?
Yes.
And is it different from Alex's purpose?
I would say in the kind of the minutiae, yes, you're a different individual than he is.
And can I ask you a question that then springs to mind?
Yeah.
Again, I'm very curious. If Stephen Bartlett had gotten cancer at 1 year old and I died.
I see. Yeah. Well, then you wouldn't be fulfilling the particulars that God had intended for you. But that kind of thing happens because we live in a broken world. It isn't the perfect world. It is not the good. It's not the totally good world that God made. Something happened that broke the world.
What happened?
Human rebellion.
At what point in history?
Well, early on with our first parents, okay?
So the first humans.
The first humans. That's why all humans since then
What
have
about
the same proclivity towards evil,
Does that
which I
include
think is
other-
pretty much quantifiable.
Does that include other species of human? Homo neanderthal, Homo
Well,
erectus,
I know that's a
Homo-
question that a lot of people are discussing right now,
Uh-huh.
okay? And where exactly do you draw the line? And that isn't an area that I go deep in, but I do think that there was an original progenitor to the human race as we understand it right now
Sure.
that has the image of God in man
Mhm.
and violated God's commands, rebelled against God, and that had an impact on the world, okay?
And that is
And
why.
so therefore,
that
you're
is-
going to have
that is why
some
children
people
have
aren't
cancer.
going to be, fulfilling all of the ultimate purposes that God has for them in this lifetime.
Just to be clear,
Yes.
children get cancer
Sure.
because, say, 2 million years ago, roughly, the start of the human species,
I'm not going to set a date on it.
somebody rebelled against God's
Yeah.
commands. And that is the explanation for it.
This is a
and
fair
justification.
question, and some of these details I haven't worked out. What about earthquakes and tsunamis and all those kinds of things? Okay, clearly there is an impact of human rebellion upon the earth. Okay, what the extent of that impact is, I'm not entirely sure. But this is why I use the word broken, because it's a rather broad term, rather than trying to identify every instance of things that seem anomalous to a good world, not the way it should be, so to speak. Okay, I think that's an explanation for these things, even though we can't necessarily itemize each individual particular instance and how it falls short.
Alex, I want to put the same question to you, which is, do you think that you were born with a purpose that was endowed for your life?
No, not in the literal sense. I think that there are that I was born with literal proclivities built into my
What do you mean by
consciousness and my
proclivities?
DNAs. Almost want to do tendencies. Yeah, tendency is a great word. Yeah. For example, my tendency to eat food. I don't think I learned that. I think I was born with it. But it's like I would use the language of when you say, if you said, do you think that you were given hunger from birth? I'd be like, no, in a poetic sense, maybe. But what I mean to say is I was born with this thing called hunger, which I didn't learn, which was just a part of my makeup. I think the same thing is true for many motivations of life, such as the sort of meaning that you might report feeling. I think it's there from childbirth.
Same question for you, Alec. Do you think that we each have a specific purpose, or is it self-chosen?
I think it's both. So I'm going to introduce two concepts that we haven't talked about yet, Dharma and Karma. And I think these are concepts that are sometimes hard to understand. I'm going to do my best to kind of speed run them. So dharma is the Sanskrit word that kind of gets translated as duty. The way that I would describe dharma, the reason I think it's so important is right now, if we look at the world, people are like not having a good time. And oftentimes what they do is they're stuck between this choice of doing what they want and doing what they should. So doing what they want is maybe dopaminergic, is maybe fun in some way. Doing what they should is like painful in some way. So for me, what I think dharma is like sort of duty, but I think the key thing that helps people once they find their dharma is it's what allows you to choose the negative thing. It's what allows you to choose the hard thing. So if someone points a gun at me and I look at that gun means pain, suffering, death, my life will end and then I will have nothing to leave behind me, so my purpose will end. So I try to move away from that thing. But if someone points the gun at my child because I have this overwhelming sense of love and joy or whatever, I step into the path of that thing. So I think once we understand what our duty is, that gives us a sense of tethering. It gives us a sense of direction. I think what confuses a lot of people is that they think duty is like some transcendental, it's like a big thing, like duty with a capital D. Like I was born on this earth to do these like particular big tasks, like I need to say cure cancer or something like that. Oftentimes dharma is really small. So the way
duty is not transcendent, then it's not tied to some moral transcendent thing.
I think I don't know about moral. So this is where I think
You said should.
Yeah,
one versus should. So that's usually a moral term, right?
In the West, right? So I think there's a whole different set of axioms.
Okay.
I'm using dharma, and that's what people will like put morality onto dharma, where I don't think that that's actually fair. So going back to I have a duty, just to give another example, and y'all can decide whether this is moral or not. But when I'm sort of working in the emergency room and, a patient walks in, I have a duty to that patient. So what a lot of people don't understand about dharma is that it is very environmentally determined. So your dharma will depend somewhat on, the family that you have, the responsibilities that you have. If you have children, you have a dharma to those people. So I think that's one part of what we would call purpose. I think the other part of purpose, and I think this gets really closer to the more Western conception, is karma. So going back to your question about, if a child with cancer dies at the age of 1, is their purpose fulfilled? Arguably, yes, because that could have been their purpose in this life, right? So their purpose could have been, so there's a really interesting story about, many years ago, there were a group of angels, I'm just going to use the Western terminology, devas, who disturbed Shiva in his meditation. And so he cursed them and he said, the curse that you guys are going to do is y'all are going to be born on the earth for one lifetime of a human. And then the devas were like, oh my God, like this is terrible. Like we're going to be cursed to be born on the earth, and the earth is full of suffering and Sisyphus, and there's no meaning with a capital M. So then they go to Shiva's daughter and they ask her, hey, can you help us out? Like, can you please go talk to your dad? Can you please get him to change his sentence? And she says that Shiva's never going to change his sentence. That's impossible to do. He's also kind of this embodiment of karma and things like that. So he says, but I can help y'all out. What I can do is I'm going to be born with y'all. And then there's this other story in the Mahabharata where basically she has 7 children and then she drowns them the day after they're born. And so she says, the technical situation is you're going to be born for one lifetime. I can make a lifetime happen in a moment. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's moral. I don't know if it's mythology.
But a potential explanation for why children get cancer.
It's a potential explanation for why children get cancer. Now, I think the karma thing is when you said, is your purpose in life predetermined? So I think that you inherit a certain amount of circumstances, and that part of your purpose will be in relation to the circumstances that you inherit. But the other thing about karma, which I think a lot of people misunderstand, is they think that it means destiny. I think all it means is Newton's third law, which is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That while you may inherit a set of circumstances, the way that you act is sowing seeds for your future life. So this is where, I know I'm introducing a bunch of concepts, and it's interesting. We started a membership program here at Healthy Gamer, and part of the reason we did that is because a lot of these concepts, if you turn them into 50-minute YouTube videos, people just end up with more questions than answers. So we go into a lot of depth, and I think it requires some depth because I'm sure everybody who's listening has a ton of questions. But in order to succinctly answer your question, I would say that, yeah, you were born for, I don't know about a specific reason, but there's a set of different things which only you can do. Like you are a unique set of genetics, you are a unique set of experiences, you are a unique set of psychology. And this process in psychiatry is something that we call meaning making, helps a lot when people have trauma, right? So to help someone understand, why did this terrible thing happen to you? And once you make meaning from it, that helps you adaptively. But I think that it's also not predestined necessarily. You can procrastinate on fulfilling your karmas, and then they'll just keep coming back.
So, Dr. K, I still have a question about this. You
Yeah.
you talk about duty, and I'd asked about morality there, and you kind of begged off on that. Well, not really, but then you used the word obligation and emergency room, and it sounds to me, when you talk about those things, you are actually invoking moral categories, things you ought to do, you have an obligation to do, you have a duty to do. Maybe the right thing, you didn't use this phrase, but it sounds like you're saying this is the right thing to do, the virtuous thing to do, as opposed to the wrong thing to do. So how am I to understand those phrases if they are not really invoking genuine moral categories?
So when you say moral categories, are you referring to a transcendental right and wrong?
I'm talking about ethical principles, ethical rights and wrong, if you want. They are transcendent because they're not simply in the molecules, as it were. They're above us, transcendent.
Okay,
so yes, in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are consequences to our behaviors one way or another. And the consequences, it's not just, utilitarian. It's not just, if I put toast in too long, it'll burn the toast. But you ought to do the things that you just described. You ought to help that person, okay? I think it's a fairly commonsensible word, a moral category, virtue, vice kind of thing.
I think whether it's commonsensical depends on what's common, right? So I think that this is where these concepts I don't think are one-to-one. So I think doing your dharma is basically the way I would describe your dharma is when I throw a ball in the air, it comes down.
Okay.
Right? So dharma is kind of doing what is the second part of what you've kind of signed up for.
So when you say you ought to help the person in the emergency room, all you mean is you're not morally compelled to do that in terms of a virtue, but there is a consequence for you to do that as opposed to doing the opposite.
Yes, and I think there is a layer of morality, but that is not within dharma. So for example, there are yamas and niyamas, which are things like truthfulness, ahimsa, which means nonviolence. So there's a set of different things that we would generally speaking call morality, and doing those things is usually in accordance with dharma. Mm-hmm. But the Mahabharata is a great case of someone saying, I don't want to kill my cousins and I don't want to kill my teacher, and Krishna saying, you absolutely should because it is in accordance with dharma. So I think dharma oftentimes gets translated over to morality, but I think you lose something in translation.
Greg, can I ask you, do you think you can have a fulfilling life without having a transcendent purpose?
In some measure. In some measure. What I described earlier is if God made us for a purpose and made the world for human flourishing, and I think we get a basic description of that in the beginning of our story, for example, then people who don't even believe in God or even anything religious at all, if they fall within the pattern of the things that God has created for flourishing, they're going to flourish in some significant measure. You mentioned a few moments ago about having children, and this is somewhat of a universal experience. Now, you made a kind of a naturalistic characterization of why we feel that way. My sense is that God made us for that purpose: be fruitful, multiply, subdue. And subdue doesn't mean rape the earth. It means to work productively what God has given us to serve. Now, somebody can get married and stay married and have children and fulfill that purpose there and be very satisfied in doing it, as opposed to all kinds of other variations that's just going to mess up their life. And they're going to experience satisfaction and fulfillment in it. But that's because they're, in a certain sense, they're doing the things that God has made human beings to do so that they would flourish. It's just like you can think of it in very mechanistic terms. You have a vehicle that's meant to operate a certain way, and if you do the things properly for that vehicle, it's going to run well and do.
So I can have a grand feeling of purpose if I do many of the things that are considered virtuous within Scripture without needing to believe.
Yeah, you could still be virtuous. Certainly, you can do those things. My argument, and this is what I was getting at a little earlier, Dr. K, is that if there is no God establishing a right and wrong, then there is no right and wrong because there is no law that we're conforming ourselves to. We're just doing stuff, all right? Now,
if you believe the sort of evolutionary perspective on this.
Taken as a whole, I don't. Not the way that Alex has taken. It's a grand explanation of pretty much everything.
It's not an explanation of everything. It's an explanation of the variance of life on Earth.
Because evolution does. I was thinking about my dog. I was thinking about Pablo, and I was thinking, why does he have sex with other dogs? Why does he eat? Why does he protect his puppies?
Yeah.
Why does he do these things that it's somewhat in Dr. K's example there, he takes care of things.
Yeah,
he takes care of me when I'm not in the house. If someone comes in and my girlfriend's there, he takes care of my girlfriend. He barks only when she's at home alone. So he seems to be expressing some form of morality. He seems to understand his own sort of idea of right and wrong. But I
wouldn't characterize it that way, as if he's thinking, I ought to do this, and if I don't do that, then I'm doing something wrong. I think animals have instincts that they're imbued with that can be influenced by natural factors to some degree, I guess. But they are made for purposes, and this is the reason that many of the creatures act the way they do is because of these very sophisticated instincts that allow them to get along in life and do well.
And survive and reproduce.
But I don't have any reason to think that survive and reproduce, of course. But I don't have any reason to think that they're thinking I'm doing the moral thing. And if they didn't do the thing that we would be, it would be appropriate to accuse them of doing something immoral, vice or whatever.
History's almost shown that even in times where we look back and go, that was not the moral thing, like, Nazis in World War II, they acted in a way that helped them survive in the context they were in. So the Nazi that would go to the concentration camp and then come home and be really nice to his family, he thought he was doing the right thing.
This is why one of the reasons I think the evolutionary explanation is inadequate, okay? Because it seems that there are lots of things that people do that seem to be good for them or for their tribe that characteristically we'll look at and we'll assess it. And the assessment is that is wrong, it's evil, it's wicked. And I think that our assessments are reliable in that regard, okay? That we have moral intuitions that allow us to see things that are real about that. And these things are relatively universal. I mean, it doesn't matter where you live or when you live, people are asking the question about the problem of evil in the world, okay? And I think it's because
the definition of what evil was seems to change over time. Because I wouldn't be sat at this table a couple hundred years ago because I'm black. And everybody at the time thought that was the right thing. They didn't think that was an evil thing at the time.
Well, everybody at the time didn't think that. But there are going to be social mores and that are going to change over time, and people do respond in different ways. But just because you have variations in the way people believe about morality doesn't mean that there isn't a morality that's a sound morality. And C.S. Lewis has done a study of this, looked at the kinds of things that seem to transcend culture in terms of assessments, moral assessments that seem to be true about every culture. A lot of times the differences are not differences in moral facts, but they're like the morality has actually changed, but a difference in perception, okay? So what counts as heroism in some cases would not count as heroism in other cases, even though heroism is considered a noble kind of thing.
I've been waiting for an opportunity to rewind to the fact that we just brushed over two of what I think are the best available, at least the first that came to mind, explanations as to why children get cancer. And I just wondered, as a question, whether you consider whether your explanation sounds to you as your explanation sounds to you, as I think both of them sound to me, and I don't know how they sound to you, Stephen, but the idea that the thing that we are most fundamentally confronted with, I think, on an existential level, is suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And there's our own suffering, and then there's the suffering of others, and the seemingly meaningless suffering of a child who's undergoing cancer and does not survive it. And I'm told that in the face of such existential tragedy, I turn to religion to give us a sort of sense of fulfillment and a sense of explanation. But when asked about the mechanism of how, I'm told it's because at some undisclosed number of years ago, somebody committed a sin against God, and that's why your child has now died of cancer. There are millions of people who listen to this show. There will be people listening to this whose children have died of cancer. I wonder if that brings them any kind of consolation.
Well, I don't.
Similarly, the idea that, maybe it's some disgruntled angels who didn't want to come down to earth for too long, and so if anything, you're actually doing them a favor by killing them of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's bringing the kind of fulfillment that people are looking for.
What's your answer to that?
I don't think I have one, but I don't like people professing that they do have an answer, but when it comes down to it, actually saying something which I think will provide the opposite effect. And I don't mean this personally. I mean as a point of religious explanation. The idea that this
is going to bring comfort.
Everyone's going to get a chance to respond to this.
Sorry.
The idea that this even approximates an explanation as to why this happens. I would ask you to consider what you find more likely if we assume that we are essentially existing here as accidental accidental organisms just competing in a struggle for survival with no endowed meaning or supervision, what might we expect to find? And I would ask what you would expect to find if we were created with purpose by a loving God who wants us all to come into communion with him, but for some reason thinks it's necessary that we exist in this vale of tears, in this material world first. Well, what would you expect to find? I don't think. And then look at what you do find. Look at what you do find in the natural world. Even if you just take into consideration non-human animal suffering, just an unfathomable amount of negative experience.
Right.
For seemingly no reason, not to mention the fact that children are getting cancer, as you say, and as you've already alluded to, there are evils that humans commit, like the Holocaust, but there are evils which they don't, like earthquakes and tsunamis and the like. Well, I don't think we would expect to see any of this if we assume that hypothesis. But if we assume that we are just accidentally existing organisms in a struggle for survival, not only do we explain this, but we also come to expect it. So I think it provides a much better explanation. That is not to say justification. The idea, we were talking about evolution, and you said that the problem that you have with the Darwinian worldview is that it seems to favor survival of the fittest, and yet there are things which evolution seems to point to that we would morally condemn. Well, of course, because evolution by natural selection is an explanation for how things got the way they were. It's in no way a justification for behaviors.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.